I know these days the concept of a Spider-Verse is well within the mainstream, but over a decade ago it was hardly the case, with the idea of a superheroic multiverse being left only to one TV episode, and in our case, one video game. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions came out at a time when Spider-Man games were becoming increasingly synonymous with open worlds, because the way the character moves is one of his most defining traits. Since Spider-Man 2, every Spider-Man game aside from the mediocre Friend or Foe had been an open world. So imagine the surprise when Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions was a linear, combat-focused game. Even conceptually, if you were to tell me you're making a Spider-Man game with minimized traversal and no open world, I'd call you crazy. Well, as is often the case, I was dead wrong, because in spite of what you might think, this game kicks an unbelievable amount of ass. On an otherwise normal night, Mysterio breaks into a museum to steal the Tablet of Order and Chaos, a tablet with the ability to warp both space and time. Why is it in a random museum? Who gives a shit? When Spider-Man swoops in to save the day, the tablet gets broken, causing its pieces to be shattered across different dimensions, all home to different Spider-Men. With the help of Madam Web, the four Spider-Men are able to band together to get the pieces from a slew of villains and restore order to the dimensions. You'll notice the phrase dimension being used interchangeably with multiverse, Spider-Verse, or just universe, and it's because as far as Marvel is concerned, that's what dimension means. The four Spider-Men are Amazing, Noir, 2099, and Ultimate, who offer their own playstyles, enemies, and art styles across 14 different levels. The game succeeds at a lot, fails at a little, and overall, I'd recommend you buy it. Of course, as always, it's not available for purchase directly from Activision, so you'll need to find a used copy or perhaps sail the high seas. After 14 years, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions remains a good game, a great game, and represents a style of Spider-Man game I think we need to see more of these days. It's short, sweet, linear, but not without depth, and that's actually where I want to turn my attention to first. The reason an open world seems synonymous with Spider-Man is because moving around New York City is as integral to the character as his list of villains. Spider-Man without his webs is just man, so it seems insane to have a linear Spider-Man game. But what I initially failed to consider is that there's a ton of room for more variety than if the game was simply within New York. When a game takes place in an open world, it's often going to have limits, not with how far you can go, but with how far the game can go. Most open world games have missions that take place entirely in an open city, but having a series of set levels allows developers to take you all around the world. In Shattered Dimensions' case, it's a jungle, a mine, the future, the past, a game show, SHIELD HQ, and because we only get a slice of each, every level feels unique in some way. But they can only feel unique when set alongside something we know, and that's where the Amazing Spider-Man comes in. I may not have a lot of hair up on this head, but on my other head, it is deep in the jungle. I take a lot of pride in polishing the family jewels. I consider it a gift to myself, but because it's the season of giving, I have a gift for you. This is the Manscaped Performance Package 5.0, and I want to draw your attention to the star of the show, the Manscaped Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. It's got an LED so it's easy to see in the dark, and it's even waterproof so you can use it in the shower. And this bad boy even comes with 2 interchangeable skin-safe blades so that your gift to cougars doesn't look like Freddy Krueger's. Isn't that cool? Speaking of aging, as you age, you'll notice that you get some hair in some unsavory places, which is why you'll need the Weed Whacker 2.0. Once you're finished with the job down under, you can finish it off with the Crop Preserver and Crop Soother. The Crop Soother is an aftershave ideal for preventing razor burn and itching. And the Preserver is a scented lotion to ensure that your jingle bells won't be stinking enough to ruin a potentially white Christmas. But wait, there's more. Cradle your cojones in the Boxers 2.0 and store your utilities in the Shed 2.0. So what are you waiting for? Use code AQUA at the checkout at manscaped.com or click the link in the pinned comment or description to get 20% off of your next purchase and free international shipping. Come give the world a real gift, not smelling like shit, and feel good while doing it too. Don't believe me? Look at these before and after photos. So use code AQUA at manscaped.com for 20% off and free international shipping. And keep that North Pole fresh. Your balls will thank you. This version of Spider-Man is tried and true. Classic costume, classic villains, and generally classic gameplay featuring a heavy helping of web weapons like hammers, chain ball, whatever things, along with more tactical web uses like pulling and swinging. The basic web functions are given to each Spider-Man, but Amazing Spider-Man is the only one to make use of web constructs, which give him that special sauce along with his art style that seems reminiscent of an older cartoon or comic. His voice, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, as it featured Neil Patrick Harris, who previously voiced a character in an animated series, which was relatively new when this game had been released. Amazing Spider-Man's greatest strength is the bombastic use of web constructs, though I will admit that his gameplay compared to the others feels rather vanilla. The enemies you fight are all grounded, aside from Sandman, who's grounded in other ways, and generally the starting stage with Kraven was one of my least favorites, especially because of his goofy mug that the game insists on shoving quite literally in your face at all times. Shattered Dimensions for some reason puts you in first person mode a lot, and honestly, I don't mind it at all. It heightens immersion, sometimes heightens the size of the enemies, and was unique enough for it to be carried by novelty if nothing else. With most boss encounters, there will be a small QuickTime event where you can dodge some of their attacks and dish out your own, but they could have done more. The fistfights would be better if there were more back and forth between you and the villain. Punch them while at the same time dodging their attacks, countering, dodging in certain directions. As it is, we just punch away before we're forcibly stopped, and then the boss gives a 3-second windup for an attack that is dodged the same way every time, and with a button prompt on screen too, as to not leave any players behind. Neat the first few times, but boring by the end. Level design wise, I found the amazing levels to be rather repetitive, as the color beige will be present across all of it. The jungle is the most unique environment, but the Sandman and eventually Juggernaut levels blend together enough for me to feel like the environments for the two could be swapped without jarring players. The Amazing Dimension isn't the only victim of this, but I believe it doesn't have the same excuse as the others. The Amazing Dimension has room for more interior fights, brighter colors, a less saturated palette, but what is here still entertained for mechanical depth more than anything. Fortunately, the other dimensions are not nearly as vanilla idea-wise, and we can look to the Noir universe to see how the monochromatic color palette can aid gameplay and provide an excuse for any aesthetic gripes. The Noir universe, as you might imagine, stars Spider-Man Noir, voiced by Christopher Daniel Barnes, who just fucking kills it here. I mean, look, it might be a more mature voice, and maybe it has something to do with growing up watching the 90s cartoon, but every time I heard his voice, I felt like I was right at home. The color palette here is much simpler, going for a sepia tone when exposed to the light, and when hidden in shadows, everything is black and white, which offers a unique way of showing players that they are in the shadows. The issue I ran into sometimes, and perhaps this is my eyes being admittedly poor, is that I would not be able to immediately tell the difference between being in the shadows or being in the light, and this was especially the case when the light sources became less defined and more varied. It may seem like a nitpick to make us think about it, but when your character that is entirely based around stealth only has a few mechanics, those mechanics should be rock solid. Stealth is where a majority of the gameplay takes place, and the basics are, if you're close to an enemy, you perform a takedown. All enemies have undefined vision cones that are extremely small in the dark and extremely large in the light. There are wall takedowns, perch takedowns, and stationary takedowns. While not explicitly explained to you, there are also mild noise mechanics, so if you drop behind an enemy from a high distance, they will hear it, turn around, and spot you. That is it as far as stealth mechanics go. No hiding bodies, no control over how enemies are taken down, which is a shame as some animations will have Peter being lunged forward into the light and others will keep you in place. I don't intend to criticize this because I think the game needs more, but because the game thinks it needs more. At many points, especially as you move forward with the Noir levels, you'll notice that open combat, which is explicitly discouraged, is presented more and more. In a vacuum, it offers good variety, but why would we engage in combat as Noir when combat is all we do as the other Spider-Man? Don't get me wrong, there are differences between their fighting styles, but when this is the only time we get stealth, why should we be afraid to make those levels only stealth? I admired some of the open combat sections and boss fights, but I appreciated the stealth sections far more because it was thematically correct and was a unique twist on the character. I would have liked to have seen a bit more of it and more depth too, especially when we consider that the combat has much more to offer. It's also a shame that the detective vision is applied to all Spider-Men, making Noir's special utility not all that special. It's not as though they're out of ideas either, as each level provided a unique challenge, with the carnival being a specific highlight. At said carnival, there are fireworks going off every few seconds that temporarily illuminate the entire park, yourself included, which forces you to move faster and play with a light rhythm that made this level the most challenging and the most fun. The only time inconsistency was noticed was during the goblin fight, as when you enter stealth, you'll be spotted while in the dark, and I couldn't figure out why. I don't think he saw me, but he clearly did, and maybe it's a skill issue. I also found that the first-person perspective enhanced Noir's aesthetic, as especially with the Green Goblin and Vulture chases, we got to see the well-crafted atmosphere as close up as possible. If we travel forward to the future, we'll find that there's a return to basic combat, this time with greater focus on speed. Ironically, 2099's special ability is one that causes the game to slow down, and while many believe this to be a useful utility, I never found it made much of a difference outside of a specific enemy. Said enemies fire rockets at you that come so fast so you can't reliably dodge it without slowing time, so I held on to the ability all the time, as it was on an admittedly short cooldown, to make sure that whenever that specific enemy showed up, which isn't that often, they can be dealt with immediately. Regardless, the other gimmick of 2099 is verticality, as you'll be diving through obstacles, and this was a fun mix-up. It's quite simple, but like the first-person Punch-Out segments, it never stuck around long enough to get old. Where 2099 struggles most is in the environments. I found the future to be oddly dull, which I know contradicts all the bright lights, but what I mean is that, especially interiors, felt samey. I couldn't by a single screenshot tell what stage I was in, and I think for a game that's biggest strength is variety, is odd. Maybe it lacks the dystopian aspect of it. This version of the future has actual flying cars, massive neon architecture, and while at first it was nice to look at, it was all we saw that indicated it was in the future at all. If the future is all just bright lights and metallic finishes, that seems more like purgatory. Fortunately, I always looked forward to how 2099 handled its villains, and the answer is very well. This applies to every boss encounter to be fair, but I specifically love the design of 2099 Hobgoblin and the Scorpion boss and class of enemies that made that level visually interesting, as we see a direct clash between organic life and synthetic structures. Aside from the usual praises like animation work, nothing about these dimensions stood out to me, and maybe that's a hot take. But at least the game finishes its cast out with the absolutely stellar Ultimate Universe. I know, I'm a sucker for Ultimate Spider-Man, but damn it, this universe is not absolutely leagues above the rest. Let's start easy with the symbiote, which features tendril whips with each attack, set attacks seeing Peter not using his arms anymore and just letting the suit take over. We also get a rage mode, which while completely unoriginal, was at least used properly. Many of the encounters here are as hard as they come, with tons of enemies that are made significantly more doable by utilizing the rage mechanic. Once some upgrades are purchased, you'll spend more time inside Rage than you will outside of it. And while it does mean the combat will see some repetitive animations, it also never gets old mowing through crowds of enemies like I was playing Dynasty Warriors. The art style here is just perfect. It totally builds upon the foundation of the Ultimate Spider-Man video game and made me even more heartbroken that we'll never see this universe in game form ever again. Despite my gripes with the absolute lack of Ultimate Spider-Man now, the point remains that this was by far my favorite dimension, and I looked forward to every single level. It helps that the cast of villains here are extra bombastic. Electro balloons to the size of a building, Carnage creates zombie invasions, and we get a whole level dedicated to Deadpool, who would later get his own game that I covered on the channel. I think the variety in locales, villains, and general gameplay is at its peak here. Electro's goons all have the ability to teleport, often to vantage points. The Carnage zombies hold power in numbers, and the Deadpool goons are just basic enemies, but everything surrounding said enemies is great. I will admit that the gameplay did get repetitive at points, especially in the Carnage missions, as you'll be spamming the basic rage combos that, while influenced by the combos you've purchased and upgraded, are still relatively basic. But this criticism is held back by the sheer joy I still get when seeing a massive tendril slam behind Peter when doing a heavy attack. It's just full of weight and goop and I love it. Speaking of things I love, there are a good selection of alternate costumes here that offer a bit of spice to those repeat playthroughs, and the Web of Destiny does a lot to make said replays more varied, because if I can't engage in the combat out of my own interest, then you can sure as hell force me to do it by putting experience behind it. There are upgrades that can be purchased both for characters across the board and for the specific Spider-Men. You purchase them by collecting Spider Essence, otherwise experience as dropped from enemies, gained from collecting Spider Tokens, and your performance throughout a level will also be rewarded with Essence once the level is completed. The most efficient way, however, will be completing the Web of Destiny, which is a series of level-specific challenges. These made the game so much more fun because it encouraged me to experiment with different systems, look around the levels more, and when the reward is essentially more stuff to have fun with, it created an engaging snowball effect that was happening secondary to the already enjoyable gameplay at the forefront. My only gripe with the upgrades was that the character-specific upgrades were often more expensive and less useful than the upgrades that benefited all the Spider-Men. There's a general crowd control attack that each Spider can have, all bought separately, that while useful in some scenarios, is by no means a game changer. And yet if you were to buy said attack for all four, then you'd be spending way more than you would if you just bought an upgrade that boosts all the Spiders' health, or gives all of them a new or extended combo. It's not as though these were here to pad out the upgrade slots, there's plenty even when grouping them, but it just meant that there were certain moves I never bothered to buy until I was so late in the game that I had better moves that made them redundant anyways. To add to the confusion is that I liked when a combo would apply to all Spider-Men because it meant I didn't have to relearn what tools were available to me between levels, keeping track of who has what upgrades. I believe this is why most of the character-specific upgrades were things like extending the symbiote rage time and reducing cooldown on abilities, because it could offer an enhancement that wouldn't change a character's tools, only how effective those tools were. Zooming out to talk about the combat as a whole, I found it more engaging for 2 playthroughs across all Spider-Men, barring Noir. I don't want to cry about it all day, but I just found myself being a bit bored when the one character with a completely different style of crime fighting is forced to abandon it for gameplay that's already better with the other characters. Otherwise, the goons you'll fight will be nothing unfamiliar. Basic enemy, big enemy that needs to have their guard broken, bigger enemy that functions like a mini-boss. It's all here, but I'd argue that the aesthetic differences in these archetypes between levels excuses any criticism of redundancy, especially when there are, albeit minor, gameplay mix-ups to pad it out. The mini-boss-like enemies reward you with a flashy takedown once defeated, and each spider has a different takedown to see. The symbiote zombies can grab you, the electro babies can teleport, and the scorpion babies can drop acid bombs. Ranged enemies are sure to hit you plenty, but their damage is low, meaning their presence wasn't much more than a high priority annoyance. And I really only bring this up because if their damage was higher than that, genuinely, they would be the biggest pain in the ass, and I'm glad that Beanox was able to strike that perfect balance. I say the bullets hit you a lot, but if you're good, you'll be able to dodge said bullets with the dedicated dodge and roll mechanics, but that's only theoretical. In practice, the dodge mechanics are extremely, pardon the pun, hit or miss. Sometimes just tapping before an enemy would attack would work, other times I would have more luck holding it the whole time, and other times, no matter what, I would be hit. I also found that when more than one enemy attacked at the same time, it wouldn't dodge them both, which was frustrating too. It became especially frustrating when having to dodge roll. You dodge roll by holding the left trigger and then pressing X while holding the direction you want to roll towards. Alternatively, tapping the trigger will do the same thing. This move is used for heavy attacks that cannot be normally dodged and are indicated by the Spider Sense logo over Spidey's head. When a regular attack and a heavy attack come at the same time, you gotta pick which one you want to dodge, because half the time, you won't be able to dodge both. Even in one-on-one fights, the dodge showcases that it doesn't necessarily give iframes, and instead just quickly repositions you. The other issue with this dodge defense stance is that the lock-on is a massive pain in the ass and often doesn't work. Locking on serves to center your view on an enemy, but it will not stop you from punching the air behind you instead of the enemy directly in front of you. My gripe here is minor, especially given that most attacks don't do that much damage, but a game like this benefits most from discussing what doesn't work, because this video would be an hour long if it focused on all the minute things it does flawlessly. Speaking of which, boss fights, they're good, sometimes even great. Generally, they function the best when it's just you and the villain mano-a-mano, locking onto the target and circling them slowly, waiting for somebody to make a move, letting that fuse burn until the explosive clash occurs. It was tantalizing against the Juggernaut, but one thing about the boss fights that always rewards players is when that once difficult task becomes something conquered. Why is the second playthrough of, say, a Souls game fun? Because now you know the tricks, and you can experiment with the goal of not just beating the boss, but beating them well, more efficiently. I find it annoying that when trying to take down some bosses, there are moments where I am forced to wait around, specifically against Carnage where he enters a pod which forces us to defend shield agents who will eventually get him to come back out. I understand having multiple phases to a fight, but this fight, like many others, already has multiple phases. I was having so much fun thinking, holy shit, I'm doing a lot of damage, but my fun was damn near halted. Otherwise, a lot of the bosses had well-telegraphed attacks in different stances they entered. Some required me to be on the back foot, others required me to play more aggressively, and sometimes I was just trading blows, and I found them to be incredibly fun, which is a good thing given how it's where most of the game takes place. The structure of each level revolves around these villains, and you're going to face them a few times before they run away, allowing you to give chase and engage in more simple gameplay, only to catch up, have them powered up by the tablet, and become even more dangerous. Each boss also has a trick to them. It often wasn't just beating them up. For Electro, we had to get him to break the dam that acts as our arena. For Hammerhead, we had to find ways of getting behind him and executing a stealth attack. We throw water on Sandman before he can be attacked. There's plenty of ways boss fights and general gameplay is mixed up to the point where it feels wrong to not list them all. You might be led to believe that it's only combat here, and while that is a majority of it, the context changes plenty. Shattered Dimensions is by no means a long game, clocking in at around 7 hours, and while it is a game I desperately wanted more from, that's a solid length for a game. I'd much rather a game be short and sweet than long and boring. And this game is loosely tied together by the plot I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that's fine, but hardly present. The premise is a basic excuse for all the gameplay pieces to fall in line, and I can't complain, especially when a multiversal story in my eyes is so inherently complicated that you either get right into the weeds with it or keep it basic. Shattered Dimensions opts to keep things simple, and it works in the game's favor. As the Spider-Men continue grabbing pieces of the tablets, Mysterio was able to get one of his own, and holds Madam Web hostage, claiming he will only release her once Spider-Man delivers all the pieces of the tablet to him. Once doing so, Mysterio becomes a god and is able to tear down the fabric of space and time. The four Spider-Men do their part to take him down in what is a bit of an underwhelming fight, and that's where the game concludes. I wonder why we never got a fight with a human-sized Mysterio at the end. Like, maybe he doesn't have the tablet but still wants to put up a fight. I would have loved a final first-person sequence, except now, each swing, jab, uppercut, hook is of a different Spider-Man. Otherwise, the final fight was a decent enough test of strength, and I'll admit that the ending narration from Stan Lee was a good touch. Keep in mind, this was developer Beanox's first crack at a new Spider-Man game, and the fact it sold more than Web of Shadows means they were pulled into the Spider-Man sweatshop, forced to churn out releases on the regular, quickly following up Shattered Dimensions with Spider-Man Edge of Time, which too was received well, but then they would go on to make the first Amazing Spider-Man game, and then the critically panned Amazing Spider-Man 2 game, before being canned like those before them. Also, since I don't want to mention it when I cover Edge of Time, I wonder why they chose to have Miguel and Peter be the stars of the next game. To me, Noir and Ultimate were by far the most fun and visually diverse dimensions with a ton of depth. Regardless, it's a shame that as far as video games go, this is the last we would see of any Spider-Verse. Given the popularity of the Spider-Verse movies and given the wider diversity of the different Spider-Men and women, it truly feels like now is the time to bring the concept back to the video game medium, assuming Insomniac gets a break at some point. I also think a return to a more linear Spider-Man game could do the character some well. We're getting to a point where the open worlds are getting bigger, the story's getting crazier, the fate of New York is now a walk in the park. Maybe we take a page out of this game's book, or for a more recent example, the Guardians of the Galaxy game, and create a tighter-knit game with replay value, instead of one that is so wide and shallow that while it may spread out as far as the eye can see, we break our necks the moment we dive in. Ultimately, by the time I finished Shattered Dimensions, I found myself appreciating it a lot more than I did as a kid. And while that is the case for pretty much every Spider-Man game I've covered, I'm still happy to see that trend continue, and I certainly hope it continues into Edge of Time.